Mau sekarang? Usually we'll get delayed for like 9 to 10 seconds ya.
Yang dapat menjangkau konsumen.
Good afternoon, Binusian. Thank you for logging in and joining us for Binus Virtual International Seminar. It's your host, Fajar from Binus International Office, and I couldn't be more excited to welcome you all to today's discussion about Southeast Asia and transnational cinema. Firstly, I'd like to warmly welcome Dr. Eki Manjaya, a film critic, a film scholar, and also a faculty member from Film Department, Binus University. And I also would like to welcome our distinguished speakers, Dr. Yeo Min Hui, the Assistant Professor at the Department of Chinese at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. And we also have Professor Adam Ni, Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, Media and Creative Industries at Singapore's LaSalle College of the Arts. And we have Dr. Thomas Barker, a research affiliate with the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Students, before we go any further, I'd like to share with you some housekeeping rules. First, we mute your microphones to avoid any unexpected noises during the webinar. And we would be so very happy if we could see your faces. So if you can, please turn your camera on. For Binus students, please change your display name with your student ID followed by your name. You can see the format and also the example on your screen. During the discussion later, if you have anything in mind, please let us know by typing out your questions on the chat column. We will read your questions after the presentation is finished. Last but not least, please remain until the end of the session, as we would need you to complete an exit ticket. Exit ticket is required to record your participations and for us to submit your SAT points. So please don't miss it. Thank you. Now we have arrived at the core agenda of this webinar. On this opportunity, we are very privileged and honored to host presentations from our distinguished speakers. They are in attendance to share with you their ideas and perspectives related to our topics today about Southeast Asia and transnational cinema. And to lead the discussion, I'm very happy to hand over the screen to our moderator, Dr. Eki Manjaya. Dr. Eki, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Mas Fajar. Hello, everybody. My name is Eki Manjaya. I'm the host for this event. I'm from Film Department at Binus or Bina Nusantara University in Alam Sutra. And today I'm very honored. We are very honored to have three great speakers, three great film scholars focusing on Southeast Asia. And we have Dr. Yeo Min Hui, and then Professor Adam Ni, and then Dr. Thomas Barker. Welcome to our event. This is our fourth academic series, held by Film Department at University. And of course, this event is supported by International Office, Binus University, and then also Knowledge Management and Innovation Center in Binus University. And this event is live streaming at the Binus Film YouTube channel. And of course, the event is in conjunction with ASEACC. If anybody who are not familiar with ASEACC, ASEACC stands for Association for Southeast Asian Cinemas Conference. Okay, without further ado, I will start. But first, let me introduce the topic, why we choose this topic, Southeast Asia and transnational cinema, because in the last, I think in the last 10 years, the discourses on transnational cinema is emerging, yeah, becoming trend. But as far as I know, there are only few papers or discussion on Southeast Asia in relation to Southeast Asia or Southeast Asian cinema. So that's why we have this discussion. So we want to know whether to what extent can we, discuss and the important and the significance of transnational cinema, if we can see it and apply it to Southeast Asian cinema. Okay. First of all, let me say hi to the first speaker, Dr. Yeo Min Hui. Hello, Min Hui. Yeah.
Hi.
And yes. You are in Singapore, right?
Yes, I am.
Singapore. Okay. Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and we'll discuss about P. Ramlee in Hong Kong, and then the second one is Professor Adam Ni, LaSalle College of the Arts, Singapore. Hello, Prof. Adam. And he is in New York City, so we have international, speakers here.
and my apologies, my video seems to be going in and out, so I only got half of that. So hopefully,
if you have problem, probably you can turn the video off, just in case if you, just in case. But hopefully you can turn the video on during the discussion. And last but not least, Dr. Thomas Barker from University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. Hello, Thomas.
Hi, Eki.
It's for the second time. Thomas is here. The last year we had a very warm discussion as well, and Thomas will discuss about Hong Kong Indonesia cinematic connections, and probably many of us will get surprised of what, because I'm also involved with the research, more or less about this Hong Kong Indonesian cinematic. So we have Malaysia and Hong Kong with Ramlee, and then Malay at the time, and then South Korea and Thailand, and then Hong Kong and Indonesia is that. Okay. First, I will offer the Min Hui first, ladies first. I will read the abstract, the abstract of Yeo Min Hui. P. Ramlee in Hong Kong. P. Ramlee is indisputably the most celebrated film star and director in Malay film history and artist today. Much has been said, but his artistic contributions to Malay cinema, particularly his use of social realism and championing of local concerns. Unbeknownst to many, however, is his attempt to transnationalizing Malay cinema. In the 1960s, P. Ramlee made plans to make series of Malay films in Hong Kong in what would have been Malay film industry's first few attempts at transnational film production. In this presentation, Min Hui will seek to reconstruct the narrative of P. Ramlee's Hong Kong endeavor, hoping to revisit and interrogate this early moment of transnationalizing Malay cinema. Yeo Min Hui received her DPhil degree from the University of Oxford and is an assistant professor at the Department of Chinese at Nanyang Technological University. Her research interests include film and cultural connections between East and Southeast Asia. She has co-edited a pictorial biography on the Queen of Amoy dialect cinema, Chong Sit Fong, entitled Shui Ni Fang Zong Zhuang Shui Fang. I hope I pronounced it well.
That's correct. Perfect.
Thank you. Her first monograph, Our Cinema, Our Home, Amoy Dialect, Cinema and Dialect Identity Transformation in Singapore and Malaya, was published in 2020. So please, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. First and foremost, let me share my screen. Okay, hi everyone, and thanks so much, Eki, for the invitation. So I think like Eki, transnationality in Southeast Asian cinemas is something that I have also been thinking about a lot these days. So I feel really lucky to be on this panel today, and I'm looking forward to all the talks and discussion later. So the title of my talk today is P. Ramlee in Hong Kong with a question mark. Okay, P. Ramlee is no stranger to all of us who are familiar with Southeast Asian film histories. Luminously cast in Malay and Malaysian film history narratives, Ramlee is often touted as the most celebrated and talented film star in Malay and Malaysian cinema. So well loved by fans and most critics for his charisma and artistic achievements, P. Ramlee is also best known today for being one of the first few Malay directors in Malay film history. His championing of local stories and spirit of social realism, or rather social critique, is now a recurring motif in biographies and film history narratives. The singer, actor, writer, and director has thus become nothing short of an icon or embodiment of localism and nationalism. Right? Today, aside from the Memorial House in Penang, there is also a P. Ramlee Memorial Gallery in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. According to official discourse, the gallery symbolizes official appreciation of P. Ramlee's contribution to the local arts industry and purportedly serves to, quote unquote, encourage research and study in national arts and culture. So given the predominantly localizing and nationalizing discourses surrounding this prominent figure, P. Ramlee's attempt at transnationalizing Malay cinema during the 1960s remained largely obscure. Very few people today remember that P. Ramlee once envisioned and made plans to bring Malay filmmaking to the city of Hong Kong. By 1963, in fact, P. Ramlee seemed set to become the first director who would shoot Malay films in Hong Kong. In fact, prior to this, Ramlee already had his first taste of filming in Hong Kong, but not as a director, but as an actor, making a cameo appearance together with Saloma in the Hong Kong Mandarin film Love Parade. So more often than not, when I share about this research, the first response I get would be P. Ramlee in Hong Kong, question mark, right? So in this talk today, I'll be sharing with you what I know about P. Ramlee's venture into Hong Kong. I'll piece together a narrative, and then I will attempt to read this episode as a transnational alternative in imagining the future of Malay cinema during the 1960s. Okay, here goes. On 8th June 1962, P. Ramlee and his wife Saloma left for Hong Kong to make a guest appearance in a Mandarin Shaw Brothers Hong Kong film, Love Parade, Hua Tuan Jing 2. Starring Hong Kong film stars Ling Tai and Chen Ho, Love Parade is a Mandarin comedy film about the romance between a fashion designer and a gynecologist. So the story revolves around this married couple with frequent misunderstandings and conflicts leading eventually to a state of near divorce. Towards the end of the film, the character played by Chen Ho participates in an international fashion competition. And the couple finally reconciles as they re-establish love and support for one another during the competition. So this fashion competition is important not only as plot device in this film, it also introduced P. Ramlee and Saloma to the film's audiences. Donned in traditional Malay ethnic attires, P. Ramlee and Saloma performed as models in a segment of this fashion show, singing and dancing in a 3 minutes long sequence. Right? And this sequence is preceded by other sequences where models dressed in European style paraded in make-believe streets of Paris, and those wearing kimonos model in what appears to be a Japanese historical set. A similar display of Filipino, Chinese, and Western fashion follows after Ramlee and Saloma's sequence. Okay, so here I've cut a nearly 6 minutes long clip of this fashion show scene. In fact, the fashion show scene is way more than six minutes, okay? But I've cut 6 minutes, and even in this 6 minutes, I'll fast forward the parts before P. Ramlee and Saloma appears, just to give you a sense of the context of what's happening, okay? And then we'll watch the full 3 minutes of P. Ramlee and Saloma's dance and song sequence. Okay, so that will be there's going to be sound. So I'll tune this down first. Okay. Right. So we see here models dressed in European style parading in make-believe streets of Paris. Okay. And then we'll fast forward to the Japanese part. Okay, so you sort of get a sense what's going on, okay? And then now I'll bring you to the part where Saloma and P. Ramlee appears. Here you go.
Bengawan Solo riwayatmu ini sedari dulu jadi perhatian di musim musim hujan meluap sampai jauh mata airmu dari terkurung di gunung sepi air mengalir sampai jauh akhirnya ke laut itu perahu riwayatmu dulu kaum pedagang menyimpan riwayatmu夕阳映上了沙漠打动了我一帮的心海风吹动了沙漠撩起了浪一般的情itu perahu riwayatmu dulu kaum pedagang menyimpan riwayatmu.
Okay, so there it is. Okay. Right, so evidently, the inclusion of P. Ramlee and Saloma's sequence was designed to add a sense of cosmopolitanism into the fashion show, and by extension to the entire film itself. This is very much in line with Shaw Brother Hong Kong's production strategy at that time, which was to infuse Hong Kong films with a kind of modernity that articulated internationalist links and modern aspirations. This globalizing ambition is symbolized most clearly by a rotating mega globe that was featured as part of the set in that fashion show, although we didn't get to see it because it's later in the sequence. But it wasn't just the Shaw brothers who harbored this ambition. Although Ramlee and Saloma were casted to play what I feel is quite a simple representation of foreign culture in this film, Ramlee subsequently took the idea of transnational filmmaking into his own hands. The couple stayed in Hong Kong for 10 days in total. Now, at this point, I do not yet know what exactly happened during those 10 days, but it is perhaps unsurprising that right in the subsequent year, after he went to Hong Kong to shoot Love Parade, P. Ramlee announced that he is going to shoot Malay films in Hong Kong. In June 1963, Ramlee revealed in the film magazine Mestika Film that he will be making a film entitled Sanniwati and 4 other films in Hong Kong. All these films will be produced in widescreen, short scope, and color in a bid to increase the production value of Malay cinema. According to the article, the stories for these films were already submitted to the Film Censorship Department, and once they are approved, Ramlee will depart for Hong Kong. Shortly after, in August the same year, it was reported that Sanniwati will soon be directed by P. Ramlee in Hong Kong for at least a month, and thereafter the shooting will continue in the then newly established Federation of Malaysia as well. The film, said to be written by Run Shaw himself and subsequently handed over to P. Ramlee for adaptation, is about the lives of performers who were well known in the Malay community. Right? So publicity surrounding Sanniwati made it seem as though it was set to happen, or at least indicates that P. Ramlee and the Shaw brothers were serious in its implementation. In July 1963, the names of 9 other personnel who would travel to Hong Kong together with P. Ramlee were published in the Singapore-based newspaper Berita Harian. Right, so they include performers like Sarima, Haji Mahadi, Yusuf Latif, Sharif Dole, etc., as well as assistant director Sudamaji. The article also mentions that some other actors from Hong Kong would also be involved. And these people were said to be handpicked by P. Ramlee himself. Right. Furthermore, Ramlee had also started to write songs for these films in anticipation of the trip. Right. There were even at least 3 farewell parties planned for the team that was said to be leaving sometime in August 1963. Right, so these parties were organized to introduce the cast, celebrate the fact that the film will soon be shot outside of Singapore and Malaya, and also just generally to wish the team bon voyage for their upcoming trip. Right, some of these parties were even ticketed and open to the public. A very hopeful P. Ramlee also commented that he might even stay on in Hong Kong if Sanniwati proves to be successful. Right, so I think what this clearly shows is that in the year 1963, ideas about transnationalizing Malay film production in the sense of bringing Malay filmmaking outside of the Malay archipelago were being raised and experimented through P. Ramlee. And I think it's also clear that these plans were received with a considerable degree of fanfare. However, despite the hype, Sanniwati, along with all the other 4 films proposed by P. Ramlee, did not take flight. Right, Ramlee and his team never left for Hong Kong in the end. And by a twist of fate, his cameo appearance in Love Parade remains as his only transnational filmmaking attempt in his entire film career. As is well known, instead of Hong Kong, Ramlee moved to the Merdeka studio in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia on 20th April 1964, where his once illustrious film career would come to an end. Several arguments have been put forth regarding the reasons for this abortion of plans. Right? The most straightforward explanation pertains to logistical problems. So a newspaper article published in 1964 noted that the Hong Kong trip met with some administrative difficulties. More specifically, media reports suggested that the trip was postponed and ultimately cancelled due to payment issues, or in other words, due to a lack of funding. But aside from these logistical problems, one of the greatest obstacles that P. Ramlee had to overcome seems to be, to me, the mounting tension between ideas, or indeed ideals, about nationalism and transnationalism. Right, there are several evidences that point to this, but today I would like to share one particular example. So on 27th July 1963, a very long letter entitled "The Tragedy of the Malay Film Industry in Our Homeland" was published in Berita Harian. Okay, it was penned by someone named Bintang Kecil, which means a small star. Right? In this letter, small star Bintang Kecil expresses disapproval of P. Ramlee's Hong Kong plans. He cited several reasons, okay, one of them being, if Shaw Scope is not available in Singapore, why not work on it, since the Malay Film Productions Company based in Singapore at that time already exists and functions similarly? Why were not the technology of color shooting, along with other post-production technologies, brought over to Singapore if indeed there are plans to make more films such as Seniwati? The writer made similar comments throughout the letter, suggesting that making Malay films in Hong Kong is equivalent to emptying out Singapore and Malaysia's Malay film industry, causing Malay film production to eventually wither and die in its Tanah Air homeland. Right? The writer seemed to suggest that in the true interest of helping Malay cinema grow, what should instead be done is to develop filmmaking technologies within the country itself. Thus, at the heart of Bintang Kecil's opposition is the desire to develop a local or national Malay film industry that is first and foremost self-sufficient within its geopolitically defined native homeland. It is about consolidating local strength through breaking free from the monopoly that Hong Kong-based Shaw Brothers and Cathay organization had always had over the industry since the very beginning. All right. Bintang Kecil's stand, or this kind of localizing and nationalizing discourse, is widely represented in Malay film history narratives today. Dominant narratives today identify the late 1950s to the 1960s as a time when Malay filmmakers pushed for more local participation in the industry. It was also a time when the industry by and large aligned itself with the general fervor and directives of nation building and decolonization. The 1970s to 80s subsequently became recognized as what we call now the independent or Bumiputra period, where one of Malay filmmaking's major bases shifted from Singapore to Malaysia. Malay ethno-nationalism became a central organizing principle, and Malay cinema became more or less synonymous with Malaysian national cinema. I'm referring here more to the Singapore and Malaysia side of things in terms of Malay cinema film history. Yeah. So against this backdrop, P. Ramlee's high-profile Hong Kong endeavours stick out as a conspicuous anomaly, for his transnational ambitions contrasted sharply with this kind of trajectory that Bintang Kecil stood for. Instead of developing the industry within the geopolitical boundaries of the homeland, and instead of breaking free from Hong Kong monopoly, Ramlee's plans sought to improve the standards of Malay cinema in a fundamentally different way that transcends geopolitical boundaries. His is also a method that needs to rely on a continued working relationship between the Malay film industry and its Hong Kong counterpart. The case of P. Ramlee and Hong Kong thus alerts us to the fact that at the same time as the Malay film industry aligned itself with directives of nation building in newly independent Malaysia, ideas relating to transnationalism were simultaneously being raised and debated, giving rise to the mounting tension between nationalization and transnationalization in the 1960s. At the height of nationalist movements, the possibility of developing the local film industry through transnational means was also being entertained, pointing us to an alternative imagination of what Malay cinema could have been. Understanding this prompts us to approach this episode as a transnational alternative in imagining the future of Malay cinema during the 1960s. It also challenges us to rethink the predominantly nation-centric discourses and narratives constructed around and about P. Ramlee and Malay film history today. Beyond that, it highlights the potential of studying transnationality in Malay film history. So Malay film narratives, especially history narratives today, are still very much limited by nationalist agendas or the national cinema paradigm today in the Malaysia and Singapore context, right? And I believe that thinking transnationally would be beneficial to furthering Malay film studies. Lastly, I think this episode relates to a topic that I have been thinking about a lot these days, and that is transnationality in Southeast Asian cinemas. So in my view, the continuing lack of state support for filmmaking within the region, the current global climate of resurgent, even militant nationalisms, the still slow-moving efforts in constructing Southeast Asian film histories that are not nation-centric, and the rising trend of evoking Southeast Asian cinema as a self-branding label on international platforms render it necessary to better understand and activate alternative ways of seeing and imagining Southeast Asian cinemas. Okay? And one important or salient way to do so, I personally feel, is through the transnational lens. And to my knowledge, like what Eki has said also just now, at the moment, still very little has been done to investigate transnationality in Southeast Asian cinemas, whether in historical or contemporary contexts. And this is indeed something that I wish to delve into in my future projects as well. And so if anyone here, shares a similar concern about this, I'll also be very happy to connect, and then maybe we can have a sort of conversation together. Right, so with this, I'll end my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yeo Min Hui. That's a very interesting presentation. Yeah, there are so many things in my mind now, and I think we should, four of us, or probably if anybody wants to join, we can have another conversation on transnationality and in Southeast Asia. Yeah? It's very nice because I did my doctoral thesis about Indonesian exploitation transnational film as well, but it's in the late 70s to early 90s. So it's like, at least there are 3 questions, but maybe later I will hold it for in my mind. First of all, is I envy you actually, because at this very year in 1962, Usmar Ismail directed Bayangan di Waktu Fajar for Malaya film companies. I think it's for I forget this. I think for Kate or something. And before that, in 1959, he directed in in a pseudo name titled Korban Fitnah in it. And the second one, Benyamin Solo, a song written by Gesang. Usually in Indonesia we are familiar with Bengan Solo, but in Keroncong, but there is very jazzy music. And the third one, I'm wondering, during your presentation, whether your presentation has something to do with Thomas Barker's research, because around that, I think it's around that time, probably Thomas will discuss it later, some filmmakers and some film actors from Indonesia went to Hong Kong, and it's with the same attempts. Probably, is it because of Shaw Brothers, or because of something else, or because of something happened in Hong Kong or something? Probably we'll discuss, or probably we will discuss after everybody already present the papers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will move to Professor Adamni. Okay. Professor Adamni is Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, Media, and Creative Industries at Singapore's LaSalle College of the Arts. Prior to this, he held appointments at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, where he was head of School of International Communication and Professor of Film and Media Studies, as well as Nanyang Technology University in Singapore and Ohio University in the US. He has also been a Fulbright grantee in Thailand and a research fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden, the Netherlands. He has broad interest in Southeast Asian and US popular film. And let me read a bit about because Indonesia, probably in the many places in the world, because the medium, the movie was very happening a few weeks ago, including Indonesia. Many people watch the medium in the big screen in the cinema, because it's been a long time since Indonesian people watch movies in cinema. Okay, I will read the abstract. Medium Connection, South Korean Images of Thailand. The current Thai-South Korean co-produced horror hit The Medium is but the latest example of cross-pollination and crosstalk between Thai and South Korean media industries, and the penetration of their popular cultures over the past decades in particular. This interrelation has included several instances, although not a profusion, of South Korean produced projects that feature representations of Thailand, a trend which in turn can be seen as part of a long-standing phenomenon of global screen representations of Thailand, Thai culture, and Thai people. This presentation will be concerned with trying to tease out some of the characteristic qualities of recent South Korean screen representations of Thailand, and to see how this sit in relation to global tendencies in figuring the country. Such global representations have involved a constellation of iconographic images and stereotypical assumptions about Thailand that have had distinctive variations, but also striking continuities across time and media industry geography. This talk will start with a brief overview of relevant context of recent South Korean representations of Thailand and move on to an analysis focusing on the recent popular Thai South Korean action film Deliver Us from Evil in 2020. Please, Professor Adamli, the time is yours. The committee, Mas Isan, please share the PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you, Eki. And you may have noticed I'm having some technical trouble. My Zoom dropped out several times during the first presentation, so do bear with me and we'll see how it goes.
Probably you can turn the video off so you can have a better.
That might, maybe see that improves things.
During the presentation.
But that's still me talking. So we can go to the first slide, actually, the next slide. So a little bit about this project. Why do I want to look at South Korean images of Thailand? It's part of a broader interest in looking how Thailand is represented around the world, because Thailand always seems to have an excess of signification whenever it appears on screen. There's so many stereotypes, so many assumptions. So I've always wondered, well, where does this come from, and why is there so many commonalities, but also differences from country to country? So this is a piece of that puzzle, trying to trace this broader lineage of an idea. So the questions that I'm thinking about here, where I'm coming from in this is, what are the characteristic qualities of the way South Korea has represented Thailand? What is distinctive about the South Korean representations, if anything? And what are some possible determining factors for why South Korea represents Thailand the way it does? What does it say about South Korea's perception of Thailand and about its perception of itself in relation to the world? And just to be clear, there's also a lot of TV shows set in Thailand. I don't have time to discuss those. I won't be discussing some earlier films. So, for example, this poster is from a film called Harimau in Bangkok, 1967. If anyone knows anything about it, let me know. I'm trying to track down. But these will be mostly about contemporary films from the current wave. But I also won't be looking at things that are straightforward co-productions where it's mostly Thai creative input. Films like The Medium that Eki just mentioned, or The Kick from 2011, which was a film about a Korean family in Thailand that had a Thai director, Thai scriptwriter. That doesn't really fit into this category of what do South Koreans think of Thailand. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the contexts we might think about that don't directly determine these representations, but some of the related factors we want to keep in mind is, first of all, most obviously, that there is a Korean wave, that Korean media is reaching out, that is a phenomenon in terms of pop music, in terms of TV shows, and in terms of film as well, as part of an intentional policy on the part of industry, on the part of government, to grow this particular creative industry by training producers, putting money into film schools, giving support to producers who want to get projects started. And then subsequently, that's from about the mid-90s, and then subsequently additional money being put in to support film producers who wanted to have co-productions abroad, who wanted to go to film markets abroad. So this is part of a calculated policy on the part of Korea and the South Korea and the South Korean media industries in growing this industry, and they did so successfully, and getting a larger market by reaching out to the world, and Southeast Asia in particular has really been a target since the mid-2000s for the Korean media industry. One company in particular, CJ Entertainment, has had multiple co-production agreements with companies in Thailand and elsewhere, partly to do remakes of South Korean films, but also to have other kinds of co-productions. For example, where we have South Korean personnel working on Thai productions or South Korean characters in a Thai set film, for example. We can place this also more broadly in terms of a larger economic history of South Korea. If we're going to broaden out further, what are the determinants of these images? South Korea as a country that was hurting after the Korean conflict into the early 60s, but managed to pull itself up into the 70s and 80s to become known as one of the little tigers. And it did that partly by having very rigid and calculated industrial policies and national policies for its economy, which for a long time required the population to sacrifice, to work hard, to not have the benefits of an easy life just yet, for the good of the country. But this in turn, though, has led to some disaffection among South Koreans about corruption in government, and also corruption in the big corporations, which have reaped the benefits of this growth in South Korea into the 80s and 90s, what are called the chaebol, who are these mega corporations where there have been many instances of corruption that have been found in the government and the corporations alike, and a feeling on part of the public that they didn't get their fair share. And this will come up in some of the productions that we look at. The last factor I would mention is simply the specific economic social relationships between Thailand and South Korea obtaining at the time of these films. Very important that Thailand is a key tourist destination for South Korea. The most tourists into Thailand come from China and Malaysia. But after China and Malaysia, we have equal numbers from South Korea, India, and Japan. So those are all major inflows of visitors, a place that's really on the map in terms of the South Korean consciousness and interest in for South Koreans. But at the same time, more South Korean tourists go to other locales. It's a kind of middle level of interest for South Koreans. Likewise, in terms of investment, yes, there is an important level of South Korean investment in ASEAN broadly and Thailand in particular, but not as much as some other countries. So, for example, Vietnam and Philippines are a bigger interest for now. And indeed, in point of fact, there aren't that many examples for us to look at in terms of Thai set films produced by South Korea. Nevertheless, the few examples that there are, I think, are instructive and are worth looking at. So let's go to the next slide. So for the period looked at, that is the rise of the Korean wave to present, this may be pretty much it in terms of feature films, partly or fully set in Thailand that are South Korea produced. And if people know of other examples, please let me know. I put my email at the beginning and end so people can contact me, because I do want this picture to be as comprehensive as possible. The first example, we can go to the next slide. Typhoon was, at its time in 2005, it was designed as a blockbuster. This was the biggest budget film to date at its time. And part of its making itself big was not only putting in a lot of money, having a lot of nice special effects, a lot of action, but also very importantly, having a lot of countries involved in the narrative. And the narrative is a kind of a crime and terrorism drama. There's pirate activity in the waters off South Korea and off of Thailand. Ends up being centered in Thailand because the narrative tells us that this is where a lot of criminal activity takes place. This is where a lot of the pirate activity is managed and controlled from. And this is a theme we see repeatedly coming up in these representations. And Thailand is a center of crime because it's loose in terms of regulation, because it's on the water, it's close to the pirate activity. It's made possible not only because its placement on the water, because it's out of the way, also though because it's shown that there's corruption in the film, that police and military are paid off to allow this to go forward. And then lastly, it also takes place because the criminals can be hidden in Thai nature. We see caves, we see jungle, and the criminals in this narrative flee and go off to these caves. Here we see a cave with a Buddha in it, where they also rather sacrilegiously have some nuclear detonators and nuclear waste, which some terrorists want to use. You see in the still on the right. And the reason that there's a Korean subtitle is because they're speaking in Thai in that sequence. So much of the film does have Thai sequences. But the film ends up being not so much about Thailand, which it moves away from, but about an unhappy North Korean who didn't get admission to South Korea and therefore wants to do these terrorist activities. But significantly, he spends a lot of his time in Thailand because this, in a lot of these films, is a place where outsider Koreans, Koreans who feel that they have no place or aren't given a place in North or South Korea, can flee to. It's a place that's open to everyone, and in particular to outsiders in these films. Sorry. So yes, let's go to the next example. A Better Tomorrow. It's not surprising that they make that in South Korea, because the original A Better Tomorrow, that's a famous John Woo film from 1986, was a huge hit in South Korea, that Hong Kong film. So this remakes it with South Korean and Thailand settings. Again, Thailand is a kind of border zone, an area of illicit activity. Criminal activity can take place there where it can't take place in South Korea. Trade in illegal arms, just as in the earlier film. And again, it's able to take place partly because of corruption, once again. Also, though, if you see in the image on the left, the gangster hideout is in the jungle, once again. So there's a sense that, oh, Thailand is full of nature. The gangsters can go there and just hide in the caves, hide in the jungles. Yes, that's a stereotype, but it comes up in film after film. Let's move to the next two films. The next slide, yes, thanks. So these next two examples were kind of a lighter tone. These are both action comedies. They're caper films. In the one case is a spy whose wife doesn't know he's a spy, and he ends up being on the job in Bangkok, but his wife is a stewardess, so she's there at the same time, and also being seduced by another spy while she's there. So in all these hijinks, he's trying to hide his career from his wife, but he's also trying to protect his wife from the seducer. And on the right, it's a series of kind of police for hire and bounty hunters coming from a range of different countries, and they're all able to operate fluidly in Bangkok, which is where, again, the terrorists, the criminals always seem to want to be attracted there because there's so little regulation because they can get around easily. But also both of these films significantly take place in a lot of tourist destinations. We have a lot of sequences taking place in luxury hotels where our protagonists are staying, but also where the criminals are doing their activity. Thailand and Bangkok in particular is part of a global international tourism economy. It's a very ritzy place where internationally mobile people, including upper middle class South Koreans, can go and enjoy themselves. Although significantly in Bounty Hunters, we once again have an old-fashioned sequence as well. The main characters, their van gets attacked at one point. They're knocked out, and the characters come to not in Bangkok where they just left, but in an old-fashioned town in the outskirts of Thailand. It's shot in sepia tones. They have a traditional feast going on. So there's always this sense of, even where we don't have the jungle, there's still this old-fashioned, non-urban, non-modern part of Thailand that comes up in film after film. There's something traditional, primitive, undeveloped about Thailand, even though the films also show images of Bangkok. Let's move to the next slide, next example. This one's in a somewhat different mode than the other films I briefly mentioned. It's not a blockbuster commercial entertainment, and actually a low-budget independent film. But even here, the focus is on Thailand as a tourist destination. This film is mostly set in Pattaya, the notorious walking street, so it's more a lower budget, a lower profile kind of tourism we see taking place. Indeed, there's the sex tourism scene is shown in this film, and it's not in most South Korean films, although it is shown in, say, Japanese films. South Korea doesn't emphasize this, except for this one film, which takes a kind of alternative perspective, being kind of indie art film in its approach. And it has a lot of images of not Thai people abusing sex workers, but Korean people and Westerners abusing sex workers. So there seems to be a critique of the outsiders coming in and exploiting the country. Even though it's South Koreans who are making the film, there's a critique of the South Korean community in Thailand. Let's move on to the next. The Negotiation, again, a high budget blockbuster, only a little bit set in Thailand, but again, Thailand is, number one, a place with natural beauty where criminals can hide out. So the criminal hideout, again, is on a remote Thai jungle island. Although the trick in this film, spoiler, is that it turns out the criminals aren't really in the hideout, but they did create a hideout in a hidden place in Thailand, because that's what Thailand's good for, corruption, hidden spaces. Also, if you see on the left, there's a lot of kidnapping always in these narratives. So we see these two gangsters who are able to walk in the tourist area in broad daylight. You can see who the gangsters are, quite obviously, but the police don't seem to mind. They can stroll around because it's Thailand in a South Korean film. And we'll move to the next film. The next slide, thank you. Do we have connection? Next slide, please. Thank you.
I think Adam has some difficulties in the internet connection, probably. Just wait for a few seconds. Adam, is he still here? Let me see. He's still here. That's the art of online discussion. Just wait for a few seconds here.
Okay, I'm back.
Yes, good. Good.
Okay, well, let's try to wrap up quickly if technology will let us.
Great. Go ahead. Yeah.
Great. So let's move to the next slide. I would just briefly mention this was a big budget hit. So it was very visible about a man whose daughter is kidnapped again. And once again, Thailand is seen as a place with lacking in law. Corruption allows this to take place. But also, as you can see on the image on the left, it's presented as being very old-fashioned. They're not in a modern hotel, but in a 1960s hotel. Everything is sepia-toned. It's as though the modern world has not reached Thailand. So let's go to the next slide. I'll just try to quickly wrap up. So again and again, we see these images of Thailand as a place that does not have the modernity of the rest of Asia, even though, of course, it does. And that includes, images of Thailand in relation to nature. Thailand less regulated, less control, and this allows crime to move in, as well as corruption, allowing crime to move in. But it also allows freedom, a place where outsiders who aren't making it in South Korean or North Korean society can go, can escape to. It's also interesting that the South Koreans in these films don't have any close relationships to the Thais. It's a very transactional, transitional kind of presence there. They're there briefly as tourists, as stewardesses, as criminals who are moving in and out of that space. This contrasts with, say, a Hong Kong film where someone always finds a relative there, or a Japanese film where someone always develops a close relationship and finds themselves, or an Indian film where families actually are shown living in Thailand as a community there. So the South Korean perspective is really distinctive. And indeed, Thailand is used as not as something that shows a direct South Korean connection with the Thais in the real world, but almost as an abstract narrative device. Here's a backdrop where we can show what the drama of being South Korean is about. And usually that's about internal warring in Korean society. As you see in this image of two people facing off from typhoon, one from South Korea, one from North Korea. This is the classic theme across much of modern South Korean cinema, dealing with the breakup of the two halves of the peninsula, wondering whether the two halves can come together. And there are metaphors, usually of siblings, that come up again and again, siblings that hate each other and love each other. And everybody knows this in South Korean film. That's always about North Korea and South Korea, wanting to come back together, but being absolutely at odds. Every single example I mentioned has a sibling relationship that's fraught, that's being dealt with. And that uses the Thailand backdrop as a kind of tabula rasa, kind of blank background where they can play this out. But it's not interested in the relationship with Thailand. It's really interested in the internal relationship in Korea. Again, I see we're short on time and my signal is not good, so we go to the last slide. My email again, if you have other examples, please do contact me. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Adamni, for such a interesting topic. Yeah, it's because it's a new topic for me, so it's enlightening, and hopefully we can explore the topic in a Q&A session. And I bet there are many questions since in Indonesia and in the world the Korean waves are happening. Yeah, so most probably there are so many questions related to your topic. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Dr. Thomas Barker. But before Thomas' presentation, I'd like to say hi to the audience. Yeah, I see so many names. Yeah, particularly Gaik. Yeah. Hello, Gaik. Gaik Chenko and Wikanda from Huntong Tan. I hope both of you can contribute to the discussion. Thank you for coming, and also for everybody, thank you for coming. And please feel free to to ask question in the chat box, or if you want to say by yourself, to want to ask question directly after Thomas' presentation, please go ahead, yeah, by raising hands. Okay. Now it's Dr. Thomas Barker's turn. Thomas Barker is a research affiliate with the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus, and previously a visiting scholar at National Cheng University, UCLA, and the National University of Singapore. He is the author of Indonesian Cinema After the New Order Going Mainstream. And I believe Thomas is in Canberra, yeah, in Canberra, and then Adam is in New York City, and Min Hui in Singapore. So it's like quite transnational for me. Thank you. Okay, go ahead. The time is yours, Thomas.
All right. Well, thanks, Eki. Thanks for the opportunity to kind of present this research, and it's great to follow two other highly credentialed and interesting talks this afternoon. So my presentation is about Hong Kong, Indonesia. And it is within this theme of transnational cinema, of course, thinking about the ways in which Indonesian cinema has enjoyed or developed certain forms of transnational connection since its inception in the 1920s as a film industry. I call it the presentation the Indonesian cinematic connections, as I explore these forms of different ways in which Hong Kong and Indonesia have been linked together cinematically over the last kind of 100 years or so, but primarily since the late 1960s onwards. So that is going to be the topic today. Mostly I will focus on the 60s and 70s, but with the 70s in particular, and also thinking about the way in which the ethnic Chinese or the Chinese Indonesian diaspora population has played a significant role in the development of these relationships with Hong Kong. And I think it broadly shows us ways in which we can begin to challenge, I think, some of those ideas about Indonesian national cinema, which I've written about previously, that Indonesian cinema has never really been closed off from the world, that it's always been interacting with, collaborating with, drawing inspiration from, sharing ideas with, engaging in co-productions with partners and others outside Indonesia. And I think the Hong Kong kind of connections, as Eki mentioned, have been somewhat unexplored, and also it is probably time to begin to kind of go back and dig out the archive on some of these topics. This is still quite preliminary, so if, like Adam, I welcome any kind of input and ideas on this one too. So if you have other examples, I'm more than welcome to discuss them as well. I guess we might also, rather than transnational cinema per se, follow the work of Daryl Davis and Emily Yu to think about maybe a kind of a pan-Asian cinema in some ways. Forms of talent sharing, cross-border investment, co-productions, market consolidation, and distribution investment in foreign infrastructure. So there are multiple ways in which these transnational connections are being made. And I think in some ways, we see the way in which Indonesia is also fitting itself into what we might call a kind of pan-Asian cinema of some kind as well. This is an image from a 1994 film called Satin Steel, and we see the main characters here realizing they have to travel to Indonesia, in particular to Surabaya, to investigate a kind of corruption or kind of business deal in the film. So we can always also see in similar ways to what Adam has just shown us, the way in which also Indonesia features in the Hong Kong imagination, and the way in which Hong Kong features in the Indonesian imagination too, through these particular films as well. We'll also see, I think, the way in which Hong Kong as a leading cinematic center for much of the latter half of the 20th century really shapes the relationships, the way in which these imaginations are formed, and the way in which Hong Kong film also plays a part in a kind of an imagination for Indonesia's Chinese ethnic Chinese population in terms of thinking about their own kind of identity as well. So the way in which Hong Kong film also plays in that. Indonesia, based on my research so far, was not necessarily a major contributor to Hong Kong cinema. I think the Hong Kong cinema and the Hong Kong film industry in particular was very adept at drawing on inspiration resources from all across Asia. But Indonesia played an important part, just as Singapore, Malaya did, just as the Philippines did, Thailand, and also more recently, China, or mainland China. But nevertheless, I think it's really important still to kind of go back and have a look at some of these connections between Hong Kong and Indonesia. Now, the Indonesian connection, of course, in many ways begins and is shaped by the ethnic Chinese diaspora population within Indonesia. I don't really want to go into a whole lot of detail around differences between Peranakan and Totok and other things here, but really just to say that with the beginnings of the Indonesian film industry or film parts of the film industry, import, cinemas, exhibition, and production, since at least the 1920s, we see a range of different ethnic Chinese actors, businessmen, talents, filmmakers, and others working in and around the film industry. There are early connections to Shanghai, which at the time was the real center of Chinese language filmmaking, not so much Hong Kong in the 20s, but it was Shanghai. But also to other sites in Southeast Asia too, such as Singapore, and the 1937 hit film Terang Bulan was an early example of the way in which Indonesia and Singapore were also connected. This was a film shot in both Singapore and Java, released in Singapore to great acclaim. Even though it was directed by Albert Balik, this Dutch journalist, it was essentially a production from the Wong brothers in Indonesia. Also in the post-independence Indonesia after 1950, we also see a number of companies owned and operated by Chinese and Chinese businesses. They will, of course, kind of be criticized for not being as nationalistic as others in the film industry at the time, but nevertheless, they were still an important part of developing kind of production, cinemas, and other parts of the film infrastructure. Nevertheless, through the 50s and into the 60s and leading up to the coup of 1965-66, we see the way in which as well that the position of many ethnic Chinese becomes quite tenuous in Indonesia. And there's a great book by Tamal Azal, I think, who's at NTU still, I think she is, who's written about this, especially in the context of the relationship between Indonesia and the PRC China, but the way in which also the ethnic Chinese population were often caught up in those politics, whether they were pro-Taiwan or pro-China, and other dimensions of people's affiliation and interests. But essentially, through the 50s and 60s, many ethnic Chinese feel that their position in Indonesia has become quite tenuous, and many leave, return to China, for example. Some go to Southeast Asia. And also a number will go to Hong Kong as well as part of that process. But also through the 60s, many ethnic Chinese will also lose a lot of their financial backing in the film industry too, and it will take some time for them to recover that. At the other end of the relationship is Hong Kong. We see the Hong Kong film industry really accelerate and take off through the 50s and 60s. This is partly because of the influx of exiled directors from China after 1949, but also the role that Southeast Asia, which is often taken to mean the Shaw Brothers and Cathay, played in the rebuilding of the Hong Kong film industry in the mid to late 50s. So Shaw Brothers really expand to Hong Kong in 56. Lo Guanto with Cathay Caris or MP and GI really gets going in Hong Kong in 56. And of course, Hong Kong becomes a major film city or center from the 60s all the way up into the 1990s as well. And they have a really important role in also connecting many of those overseas Chinese populations too, both culturally through film and cinema, but also in imagining as a kind of a modern presentation of Chinese culture and Chinese kind of people as well. That becomes very important. also through this period. Hong Kong, of course, will engage much more with mainland China after 1997 with the handover from the British colony to China. And this will also change, as we'll see, the way in which Indonesia figures into this relationship. So let's have a look at some dimensions. So really, when I think about the ways in which Indonesia and Hong Kong are connected, I have been, as with Adam, kind of collecting films and trying to figure out where the Indonesia part is, the Hong Kong part is, and how the relationship is formed. And one dimension of this relationship is through talent, often through actors or actresses on screen, but also through directors and others. So let's have a look at some of those connections first up. Really, in the probably in the late 60s and into the early 70s, we begin to see some kind of early talent migration from Indonesia to Hong Kong. Some of this is temporary, but also forms of Indonesian actors appearing in Hong Kong films. So we see, for example, probably one of the earliest examples is Jakarta, Hong Kong, Macau, 1968 film from Trino Junaidi. The story begins in Jakarta, but travels to Hong Kong and Macau as these kinds of sites of kind of mobility and imagination. Similar with Tiada Jalan Lain, No Other Way, in 1972, which you can see the poster from there. This one's interesting. I mean, Tiada Jalan Lain is also a film that is kind of a co-production of some kind. Sometimes difficult to ascertain the exact relationships here, but these are films often that, and we'll see some more examples of this, where there is an Indonesian version made and a kind of a Hong Kong or international version made of the film. The interesting one, and this will kind of become interesting later, is with Tiada Jalan Lain, there was some kind of controversy with the film when it was released. Sometimes this is framed because of some of the kind of content in the film. But according to a Berita Harian report from Singapore, it was partly also because the film was funded by a guy called Robi Cahyadi, who was arrested in 1972 for illegally importing cars. And it may very well be that the film was used as a means to clean that money. But this is mere speculation. There's a series of 4 films, Hong Kong productions that will pick up with actors Sofan Safian, Widiawati, and in one instance also Trino Junaidi. So you see the 4 films there. Song of Happy Life, Bus Stop, Oh My Love, and Secret of My Millionaire Sister. These were films in 1971. I'm still looking for information more about these. I've seen bits and pieces of these films, but it appears that Sofan and Widiawati, who may have been married at that point, or at least were quite close, probably went to Hong Kong and got picked up into these 4 different films all at the same time while they were in Hong Kong. There's another talent, a guy called Alep Santosa or Alep Sak or Shaklap Fei, who we'll talk about a bit later too, who's a kind of early Shaw Brothers stuntman who also becomes kind of appears on screen too at different points. So there's also some martial arts talent too. But the 2 that I really want to kind of mention here is probably 2 quite substantive actors, martial artists. The first is Lolie, who was active in Hong Kong from 1964 to 2001. He's the picture on the bottom right there with his white moustache and white hair is kind of one of his kind of iconic looks. He was kind of an actor who got his start in the early 60s. You can see in the bottom left there in the middle, in Heroes of Tiger Boy. He was born in Indonesia, went to Hong Kong in around the 50s, late 50s, finished his martial arts training, I think in early 62, and then got into film thereafter and became quite a well-known face in cinema. And he died in 2002. And he's one of the kind of the emigre kind of actors from Indonesia who will kind of find his film career in Hong Kong. And we could probably speculate that they kind of leave Indonesia at this point, probably because of turmoil, uncertainty in Indonesia itself. Perhaps they had the family thought it'd be safer overseas. This is speculation, but they get involved in the kind of kung fu martial arts cinema in Hong Kong. And there also popularity leverages off the popularity of the kung fu film following, the Bruce Lee popularity in the early 70s. The other kind of figure, of course, is a guy called Willie Dozan, also known as Billy Chong, born in 1957. He's a little bit later in Hong Kong from 1976 to 1989. And he acts in a whole range of martial arts films too. He returns to Indonesia by the looks of things in the kind of 1990s, and has kind of continued making films until quite recently. He's still going. So he's also quite a well-known name in martial arts cinema too. And one film, for example, that brings the both of them together, in fact, was this one called Karate Sabuk Hitam, or Black Belt Karate, from 1977. This is a film in which you see kind of two versions. There's an Indonesian director, and then there's a Hong Kong director on the particular film. Both of them appear in this film, and the film itself is set in Indonesia. The main character arrives in Indonesia to learn karate and look for his family. As well. I don't know if I've actually shared the sound, but I'm going to share, see if I can share some video with you. And I'll just show you the introduction to this film. So it's got a kind of a classic, kung fu film opening with a bit of display of prowess. But you'll see in the opening, here I'll show you the opening scene then, where the young character arrives in Jakarta, and you'll see some obvious Indonesian
先生到了，
就这儿。
哎，是的，就这儿，
谢谢，
谢谢。
哎，先生你早。哎，先生，请你不坐啊。不，我是来找我叔叔的。啊？找你叔叔？他的名字叫汤立山。啊，对不起，我们这儿没这个人，您弄错了。啊。
All right, I'll stop that share. And let's go back to the PowerPoint. So yeah, you see the kind of the image here. We see the character returning home, right, to Indonesia in some ways. In some ways, also we see the way in which Indonesia also figures into the imagination here of a Hong Kong kind of film, or Indonesian film too. Oops. Okay, so the second kind of set of connections that we might talk about is some of the Indonesian companies in Hong Kong. Now, there are two kind of significant companies that are ostensibly Indonesian that establish in Hong Kong. One is Goldig Films with the Gao brothers. This is Alex Gao, who's in Hong Kong, and his brother Hendrik Gonzali. And the second company is one called Insantra, sometimes called Insan Film, which is also a kind of Hong Kong-based company too. Now, Goldig Films, both Eki and I have actually interviewed Hendrik to kind of ask about some of this history, but I think there's a lot more still to uncover. They're a company kind of based in Hong Kong. They produce about 60 films from about 1972 to 1980. But also, Hendrik also worked in Indonesia through his company Garuda Film from 74 and until today. He's still going. His son has essentially taken over the company. But these are a really interesting company too. They, in fact, did a whole range of films, you know, not all award winners, but work with some interesting talent actually in Hong Kong through the 70s, people like Chow Yun-fat, Yuen Woo-ping, the choreographer, and others. And so they were a kind of really interesting company doing film in Hong Kong, occasionally doing some kind of work back in Indonesia as well, but very rarely in that way. But it needs to be said, for example, that Hendrik Ghazali, for example, got one of his first films that he produced was one called Ranjang Pengantin in 1974, which was produced in collaboration with the consortium Film Mandarin. So in the early 70s in Indonesia, there was this import substitution program. So you have to import films, you had to produce one. And this early film was one that was produced with the consortium Film Mandarin. So you can also see the way in which the importers as well in Indonesia also played a role in these films too. We'll see some other kind of filmmakers do occasional things as well in this regard. People such as Hatok Subroto with Elang Perkasa, Alexander Teja, and others. So, for example, this is an example of the credit title, and we can see this is from a film called The Black Belt, 1973, and we see the names Hendrik Ghazali and Alex Gao on those credits. So kind of interesting to see these Indonesian names on Hong Kong films. The other company is one called Insantra or Insan Film. This one's a little more mysterious, and I'd be interested to know more information about this one. They did a number of Hong Kong films from 74 to 88, but also Indonesian films from 72 to 83, often working with the director Iksan Lahardi, who is ethnic Chinese himself, and made a number of films, you know, in collaboration with Hong Kong partners at different times. But interestingly, with Insantra, as you see in the bottom right from this title screen from a 1981 film, they locate themselves as a company in Jakarta, Hong Kong, Manila, and the USA. And so we see the way in which this obviously Indonesian name company, Insantra, kind of operates transnationally as well. Now they, I've been trying to find out, you know, who might be associated with this company. The name Robert Jeffrey often appears, which feels to me a little bit like a pseudonym of some kind. In Indonesia, often they're associated with a producer called Yuta Suyoso. So that needs more digging. But there's at least one name that pops up that we can identify who it is. And this is a guy called Atang Latif, who, as it turns out, was a producer on one Insantra film. He's a co-producer on a film called The Fierce One in 1974. Now, he's an interesting character, if you know him. He's in the early 70s, he was essentially a big casino mogul in Jakarta. He owned the Jakarta Theatre and the cinema attached to it, as well as other cinemas. He established a company in Singapore with his sons in 1970 and became involved in property development. And his family also had the franchisee of Church's Texas Fried Chicken in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia at different points. But his name comes up, and the two pictures here are from this trial in Singapore, because in 1975, the Minister for State in Singapore, a guy called Wee Tun Boon, is arrested and charged and tried for receiving gratuity from Ateng's company. And Ateng Latif is called as a kind of witness. He kind of, you can read the proceedings through the Straits Times and other publications. He kind of denies, you know, ever knowing what was going on, and Ateng Latif never gets arrested himself. But you begin to wonder about his kind of business ethics, of course, if he's embroiled in these kinds of things. And of course, more recently, about 20 years ago, he was implicated as a big debtor in the Bantuan liquidity, the Bank Indonesian liquidity kind of scandal following the 97-98 Asian financial crisis. And he fled and all sorts of things. So you begin to wonder with this kind of figure attached to Insantra film, whether or not Insantra was a cover for money laundering, but we may never know in those kind of cases. There's also a series of kind of co-productions in Indonesian locations that are also happening. Oops, I forgot to put the date on that one, but I just want to show you 3 quick examples. Panji Tengkorak, Balas Dendam, and Pertarungan Kerasakti through the 70s. So we begin to see also these films that involve seemingly the two companies working together, essentially co-productions, although the details are often a bit difficult to ascertain. In the case of The Ghostly Face or Panji Tengkorak, we have an Indonesian version and then a Chinese and / international version. This is actually Indonesia-Taiwan film, so not technically Hong Kong, but let's let that slide. This one, these are pictures I just picked up off the YouTube copies, so that's why they're a little bit rusty. But this is an interesting one. I think this is an early example of an Indonesian company needing to make a film in order to import. We see Sejahtera Film, Benny Seherman, and also Bogasari Flour Mills, as far as I understand, was essentially Sudwicket Mono, who is Suharto's cousin. Benny Seherman would become his business partner later in 21 Cinemas. And this is a kind of a working with a Union Film Company from Taiwan, and then there's a Chinese version and a Indonesian version, and they both have very different credit sequences as well. In the Indonesian version there on the bottom left, you can see that they advertise the fact that Shang Quan Ling Fung, who plays Dewi Bunga in the film, is a kind of Ratu Silat Asia, like she's the queen of Silat Asian martial arts. And we can begin to see this also in the posters when you look at compare the posters from the Indonesia version and the Hong Kong one as well. This is the second film. This is Balas Dendam. This is a kind of co-production between Elang Perkasa and Golden Harvest. Golden Harvest, of course, was Raymond Chow's outfit after he broke away from the Shaw Brothers and they had kind of had that big success with Bruce Lee in the early 70s. So this one is kind of shot in 3 locations: Singapore, Hong Kong, Indonesia. And we can see that this is the Indonesian poster here. We can see the way in which it's positioned as a kind of co-production film. This one's celebrated as being a kind of an example of a really successful kind of co-production film. This is the kind of the Hong Kong poster version. The English title is called The Double Crosses. We see this is in a Chinese language magazine, and this is the credit sequence from the beginning of the film. So we can see in this version, this is a version I found on a Chinese streaming website. This is the Chinese version, so we can see that it's produced by Raymond Chow in this version. The city in the background there is Singapore, but the film, about 2/3 of the film is actually shot in Hong Kong. So we see the names of Tuti Kirana and Sukarno Noor. Bottom left, we see the characters at Bali International Airport, and on the bottom right, we see a little love affair overlooking a Balinese pagoda. So we see the way in which these interesting relationships develop. And the third one is Invisible Monkey Fist, or Pertarungan Kerasakti. This is a film, again, with kind of 2 versions. We see the Invincible Monkey Fist, credited to director Chan Kwan Tai, and then the Indonesian version credited to S.A. Karim, but essentially they often kind of seem to work together during the making of the film. This one, interestingly, also had Willy Dozan, the Indonesian born but Hong Kong based fighter, so interesting kind of relationship there as well. There are a whole lot of other films. I don't really have time to talk about a lot of them, but just interesting ones. VIP, for example, was a kind of another co-production in the 70s. And you can see here the Monas in the background. And this final one on the right here is one called Satin Steel, in which the female kind of police agents come to Surabaya to chase down some corrupt dealings as well. And just to finish up, and just to give you some kind of interesting kind of recent examples, we begin to see also the way in which now, probably after 1997, 98, the way in which Hong Kong changes in the way it is figured in the Indonesian imagination. So probably one of the most kind of well-known in this regard is Minggu Pagi di Victoria Park, in which it's a story about TKW, the Indonesian domestic labor who work in Hong Kong, and it's a kind of story about their struggles. So we see the way in which Hong Kong changes from, often in these earlier films, as being a site of kind of modernity and sometimes criminality, of course, becoming a site where ordinary, often female characters also exist. But we still get kind of these action films. Azerax, this one here on the right, I don't know if it was particularly successful, but has a kind of Jakarta, Hong Kong kind of element. We see some similar things here in Hong Kong. Kasarung, for example, this kind of comedy film set also in Hong Kong, also about TKW. And then on the right here, Wanita Berdara, from a guy called the Alep Santosa, who was a stuntman with Shaw Brothers, Indonesian guy who's kind of become his own kind of director producer now to make kind of film as well. So we see the way in which these kind of different relationships now between Hong Kong and in Indonesia. And just to finish up, because time is against me. So just in conclusions, and I finish here with a picture of Assalamualaikum Beijing, because I think it's also indicative of some of the changing relationship between Hong Kong and Indonesia as well. Not that Assalamualaikum Beijing is set in Hong Kong, it's set in China, of course, but as Hong Kong itself has refocused its cinematic attention to China, and Indonesia's relationship with Hong Kong has also changed. We see also Indonesia imagining China, Hong Kong in different ways as well. No longer necessarily just through the ethnic Chinese kind of population diaspora, but also in this case, through kind of a new Islamic middle class as well. So the Hong Kong or China in the imagination of Indonesians is no longer kind of the prerogative of ethnic Chinese, right? It's also expanding outwards to encompass more people as well. Nevertheless, I think we still see the way in which Hong Kong is still kind of very important to Indonesian cinema, and we see also the way in which recent action films such as The Night Comes for Us also has Iko Uwais' character beginning is in Hong Kong in this kind of criminal network before he comes to Jakarta to clean up the criminal organization. So I think we also see the way in which Hong Kong is changing in Indonesians' imagination as Indonesia and Indonesians become much more kind of cosmopolitan and global as well in their outlook and moving outside the kind of martial arts kind of genre. So that's where I'll finish, and welcome to take questions and talk more ideas.
Thank you, Thomas. Apparently it's already 3 o'clock in Jakarta time, but I think we can, if everybody doesn't mind, we can have 10-15 minutes more time to Q&A. Okay, what about Thomas, Min Hui, and Adam, is it okay? Yeah, 15 minutes, at the latest 15 minutes at maximum. Okay, does any, actually I have so many questions, but yeah, and let me in relation to Thomas' presentation, I remember that when I joined Thomas interviewing Henry Ghazali, he mentioned that Chow Yun-fat's first films were with him. Yeah, Henry Ghazali was the producer of Chow Yun-fat's first films. So that's an interesting fact for me. And then the second one is, there were times in the 1970s that kung fu instructors from Hong Kong were coming. If you see the documentary such as, for example, Darah Garuda Power or something like that. So, and some Indonesian filmmakers were threatened because silat was no longer trending for the action. That's what. Okay, before Thomas answer my comment, probably there are there any question from the audience? Okay, please chat please put your question or just raise your hand so I can see. While we are waiting, probably Thomas, can you elaborate more about it? The instructors, kung fu instructors, was it was it planned, like why and how the kung fu instructors from Hong Kong went to Indonesia and dominated the stuntman scene?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that I mean, probably it was also that talent sharing. I can imagine that many Indonesian filmmakers look to Hong Kong as the example of successful action cinema and wanted to bring that talent in and then train local stuntmen, stuntwomen, fighters as well, and work that way. So that does happen, and I of course we see even more recently with, I think, what is it? The Warrior 212. What's it called? We see again the kind of the Hong Kong choreographer brought in. But yeah, I think interestingly, I think a lot of the time it is they're kind of business relationships, I guess, film production relationships in which you bring in the actor, sometimes the director, and also the choreographer to kind of make the film the kind of Indonesian version of the kind of the Hong Kong looking film, because there wasn't necessarily the depth of talent in Indonesia at the time. So that's probably what I would think. And sometimes the main actor, lead actor in the film is also the choreographer as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Thomas. And is there any question? Or before that, I will say hi again to the audience. Yeah, from
I was going to say Wakanda has a question.
Wakanda. Oh yeah. Please, I just wanted to mention Wakanda actually, but since she raised her hand, okay, go ahead. Open your mic. Hello, it's still mute. Can you unmute? Sorry.
You can use your microphone.
Okay.
Okay. Hi Adam. Hi everybody. Hi. It's more like a reflection to ask for your thoughts rather than a direct questions to trade papers. I'll go like individual ones as I was listening to Adam, and I find it really, really interesting that you focus on South Korean and reflecting. Well, my question when I was listening to your paper was to what extent this is representing how South Korea want to position itself almost like a Hollywood industry, because it seems the representation of Thailand seems to resonate with the way Hollywood represents Thailand or kind of lower income countries. And the film that you selected seemed to come from that era in which South Korea became the kind of transnational industry. So I guess you probably can reflect more on that. And I also wonder, because I use your paper on Hong Kong, representation of Hong Kong, like Hong Kong films that shot in Thailand, and I wonder if there are any earlier films, South Korean film that was shot in Thailand, and to what extent that vastly shift the relationship between Hong Kong and Thailand shift through the representation. I don't know of any South Korean film of earlier era. I know one, I think, co-production, Aridang. I think that was reflecting the Korean War. Like Thai military sends a lot of this staff to fort during the Korean War, and there was this kind of love story going on. I think it was, yeah. So just kind of reflecting on the role of South Korea as becoming the new Hollywood, yeah. So
a couple of things.
yeah.
I mean, I didn't have time to put as much nuance as I want to develop, but there's certainly this discourse about the relative position of South Korea economically and socially in the region, in cinema as in other aspects of life, which is that South Korea is not US, China, Japan. There is this sense of, oh no, we're not quite that. We're strong, but we're not, but we are higher than Southeast Asia. That's implicit in a lot of what goes on in there. But it also, in Typhoon, for example, becomes their strength in a way. Gee, we're more connected to Southeast Asia. This piracy that's going on, it's strategically very important in the narrative to China, US, but South Korea is able to go in and do something about it, where those big powers cannot. So it's a nationalistic sentiment. But again, that's something that's very specific and distinctive. So it's not that, oh, they're the dominant and they're like Hollywood. I mean, to put the Hollywood label on, there's a couple of problems. One, that the studio system is a different studio system. Hollywood needs a whole bunch of things that aren't the way the Korean industry is structured, but also that, again, we don't want it to be, to make it just, oh, they're the dominant, so it's like Hollywood. It's really very specific to the region and the time with what's going on there. And that, had I more time, I would have do want to play out more this fact that even this notion of medium, this bad pun in my title, is about the sense of South Korea perceiving itself as being in the middle somewhere, trying to stake its claim out, but also that South Korea is also critical of its own possibility of dominance and hegemony. I mean, I think in ways, I mentioned the corruption coming up as a theme. It's very strong in a lot of the films, since the way the corporations, the way government has done things are wrong, and this dominant view of the world is something we need to mitigate against. And that's why there's this figure of the outsider that keeps on coming up in this film. It's a really ambivalent perspective on South Korean nationalism and its problems.
No, I get your point, and I okay, noted, about this is kind of more nuanced to this relationship. I noticed just when I saw the screenshot you show of Typhoon, it's the same cave as Bangkok Dangerous, which was shot 2-3 years later. It was quite, so it's kind of thinking of this Hollywood-Korean relationship. But I have reflection on I think Min Hui and Thomas' paper, just in case you want to kind of take up on it further, but don't need to. For Min Hui, I can't help thinking of also Thailand and Hong Kong connections in terms of stardom. And I was thinking of the era of 1960s. Was of course we can expand to this whole, I think, Southeast Asian transnational stardom in the early days. And I was thinking of Mitchai Bancha. I think he made 3 films in Hong Kong before he died, and he also began directing. So it'll be interesting to kind of look into that and linking to your kind of interest on transnational in Southeast Asia. I don't know much about it. I just kind of thought of that that figure. There may be more, I'm sure. But so I was thinking of that. And in relation to Thomas' paper, I was also reflecting on, again, similar to the paper on Min Hui on Thailand and Hong Kong relation, but I see the shift significantly in contemporary time with Thailand-Hong Kong relation moving on to activism and social media and this kind of cross-screen solidarity. And I wondered to what extent that resonates in any way with Indonesia. And we also have the case of the film 10 Years Thailand, which kind of borrowed the model from Hong Kong. So to what extent that kind of solidarity expanded to any kind of cinematic or social media allegiance to kind of Indonesian crowd.
Maybe I'll just quickly respond to that. So I'm not very familiar with the specific case that you mentioned, but I do actually want to share something I know perhaps about Hong Kong, Thailand film relations in the 1970s, so a decade after 60s, right? I think one important person, if you talk about stardom, would be Bruce Lee. And yeah, so several of his films were actually set in Thailand. And I've read a commentary of a film critic in Hong Kong who mentioned that somehow during this era, Thailand became some sort of a dark continent in Southeast Asia. In Hong Kong cinema in particular, right? The representation of Thailand became dark and dangerous, especially in a lot of those martial arts films that Bruce Lee starred in. So I think that's interesting. And I also want to maybe chime in on tourism industry in the 1970s. To my knowledge, I think the 1970s was where many tourism industries sort of rise up and came up as a viable national industry across Southeast Asia and definitely Thailand. So the way Thailand self-positioned itself in terms of tourism, it's starting from the 1970s to the 1980s in terms especially on sex tourism and ethnic tourism. I do think that this dimension has a quite explicit implication on the way films imagine Thailand during those times. So yeah, other than stardom, I do think we can think also on through the perspective of tourism at that time. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
Thomas, yeah.
Yeah, sure, I can add something. No, I think that's actually interesting question, Wakanda. But I wonder if I'm not sure there is any to the extent. Well, I mean, maybe there is, but at least what I know has really been about, in terms of film, I think has been that the kind of the domestic workers in Hong Kong and their kind of representation in some ways similar to some Filipino film too, because there hasn't really been like a 10 years Jakarta, 10 years Indonesia. In that sense, so there'd be something interesting to figure out.
Contemporary relationship, like
I don't know otherwise. I mean, I'm only looking at it kind of really through cinema, and that probably excludes some of that social media stuff. So I may not get around to it either. And I'll just answer the question from Inda Lestari, or just respond to it about the figure of the Nyai in the kind of Chinese Malay literature. I don't know that much actually on that topic. I think my former colleague Dag Ingversen might have been exploring that in some of his work, so we can wait for that. But yeah, I guess there is interesting, if we are thinking about the transnational connection and the way in which sometimes diaspora populations create kind of those kinds of transnational representations, or their kind of culture within a different context kind of is also used as a representation of transnational cinema, then maybe that's also something that's possible to explore as well. I haven't really explored it myself, so that's something left to be done.
Okay, thank you. I think there is one question for Thomas, but do you want to answer, or but it has nothing to do with our.
Oh, I just did. I just answered it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Should we end the discussion, or do you mind if we take one more question or comment from the floor? Because it's already 3:15 in Indonesia.
I mean, if there's a question, sure.
Yeah.
Why not?
Is there any question or any comment? Yeah, I will say hi to. Yeah, we have Tan, and I don't think Guy is here, and we have a caffeine members, Dah and Bu Mundi, and we have also Binus lecturers, Pak Irwanto, Miss Azalia. If you have any question or comments, please do. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think nothing.
I was just to respond to something that was raised earlier.
Oh, okay.
I think absolutely this, we kind of mentioned the Mit Chai-bun-cha appearance in Hong Kong films in the 60s. Yeah, that was a moment when Hong Kong was reaching out and going international as other films have done more recently. So it's not just Chai. Yeah, there are other stars from the region that you see. You look at posters from the time, films you haven't heard of now, but that would have a featured star from a Southeast Asian country, sometimes highlighted depending which market they were selling to, sometimes not. I guess Houseboat, wasn't that the one with Chai? I think so. But there were several with Thai, not just Chai, other Thai stars as well, showing up in Hong Kong films at the time. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's almost 3:20. So I think we should end this discussion, but I'm hoping that we are not stopping here related to our topic, transnationality in Southeast Asian cinema. Probably we can collaborate and elaborate and have some collaboration, not only the three of us, but probably with the other with the audience, probably Pak Bumundi, Pada, Gaitan, and everybody else in this Zoom meeting. Okay, that's the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for having us, for Min Hui, and then Adam, then Thomas, and also thank you for Association of Southeast Asian Cinema Conferences, and then thank you Binus International Office and Knowledge Management Innovation, and I hope we can have another academic this talk again in the next year. Thank you very much, and that's all from me, Eki Manja from Binus University Film Department. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Eki, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you.
I don't even know what time it is anymore.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Eki, for leading the sessions. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you very much for your kind attentions and your contributions to the fruitful discussion we had. Thank you very much. So, everyone, that marks the end of the 4th Film Department's academic series. And on behalf of Binus University, allow me to express our most sincere gratitude to our speakers, to Dr. Min Hui, Professor Adam Lee, and also Dr. Thomas Barker. Thank you very much. Thank you for your insightful presentations and for creating such a memorable and valuable learning experience for all of us here this afternoon. Thank you very much. And everyone, before we're closing the sessions, I'm inviting you to join us for a group photo. So if you can, please join us with your camera on.
Hey, one more thing, the discussion is recorded at the Binus Film YouTube channel. So if everybody wants to to listen again, please do, and like and share, subscribe. Binus Film.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Paiki. So if you missed these presentations, you can rewatch it on the YouTube channel. Film Department Binus siapa ya?
Binus Film,
Binus Film. Okay, we'll surely note it down. Okay, so everyone, please look at your camera. I'm counting down from 3, 2, 1. Okay, once again. 3, 2, 1. Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Min Hui, Professor Adam, Dr. Thomas. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pak Eki. Mungkin ada yang mau diucapkan lagi, Pak? Silakan.
Again, thank you, Min Hui, Adam, Thomas, and then Gaik as representative of ASEACC and everybody else who's coming. And hopefully it's beneficial for all of us, and see you in the next event. Don't forget to exit ticket
Yes, Pak.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You may leave the room anytime, Doctor, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now allow me to share you this. Okay. Give me a moment. Okay, so students, that was again a presentations about the Southeast Asia and transnational cinema. And now on your screen, you have a link to the exit ticket. So please to record your attendance, please complete all the required informations in the exit ticket and make sure you type out your name, your student ID, and your email address correctly. Well, it's been a great pleasure to have you all here with us. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as we did. And we are really looking forward to see you again on our future sessions. Thank you and have a great weekend, everyone.